My father's hands were shaking so badly that the phone rattled against his water glass, and the whole banquet hall went quiet as he read my text message out loud, word for word, in front of 40 of my sister's closest friends, because he thought it was meant for him. Before I tell you how this happened, let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what came before it. If you're the kind of person who has ever felt like the background character in your own family's story, stay with me to the end, because this one has a very specific kind of ending. And if you're watching this while folding laundry, sitting in a parking lot on your lunch break, or lying in bed unable to sleep, type where you're watching from in the comments, because I read every single one, and this story is for you. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 11 years working as a senior forensic accountant for a regional bank holding company headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. My job, in plain terms, is to find the money that other people are trying very hard to hide. I trace wire transfers through shell accounts. I read loan documents the way other people read novels, and I have an eye for the kind of small, deliberate inconsistency that most people scroll right past. I got into this field almost by accident, initially drawn to the logic of it more than any grand ambition, and I stayed because I discovered I had a genuine talent for the specific kind of patience it requires. Forensic accounting isn't about catching people in a single dramatic error. Most fraud, most financial deception, whether it's a corporation quietly misreporting quarterly earnings or a small business owner skimming cash off the top of a register, happens through hundreds of tiny, boring, individually forgivable decisions that only become visible when you have the discipline to lay them all out side by side and let the pattern speak for itself. I've built an entire career on that principle, that the truth rarely announces itself loudly, it simply accumulates, quietly, until someone with enough patience finally adds it all up. It is not a glamorous career. Nobody has ever asked me to talk about my job at a dinner party for more than 30 seconds before their eyes glaze over. But it is a career that trained me, more than anything else in my life, to notice when something doesn't add up, and to wait, patiently, until I had enough proof to say so out loud. I grew up in a modest split-level house on Larkspur Lane in a suburb east of Columbus, the older of two daughters. My sister Emily is 4 years younger than me, and from the time she was born, our house rearranged itself around her in a way I didn't have language for until I was much older. It wasn't that my parents, Robert and Linda Whitfield, didn't love me. I want to be fair about that, because this isn't a story about villains, not really. It's a story about a family that made 1,000 small choices over 30 years, each one so minor it could be explained away, until those choices added up to something that could no longer be explained away at all. I remember being 9 years old and standing in the kitchen doorway while my mother iced a birthday cake for Emily's 5th birthday, a 3-tier confection with a princess castle on top that she had spent 2 full days constructing. My birthday, 2 months earlier, had been a box mix cake from the grocery store because, as my mother put it, "You're not really into that kind of thing, are you, Rachel?" I hadn't said I wasn't into that kind of thing. Nobody had ever asked me. It had simply been decided, the way so many things in my childhood were simply decided, based on some private calculus my parents ran, where Emily's preferences were facts and mine were negotiable. By the time I was in middle school, the pattern had a shape I could almost predict in advance. When Emily wanted to take dance lessons, my parents found the money, even though it meant my father picking up weekend shifts at the hardware store where he worked as an assistant manager. When I asked, at 13, if I could take a summer coding class at the community college, $22 for a 6-week session, my mother told me we needed to be careful with money that year. I found out later, going through old bank statements as an adult, doing exactly the kind of work I do for a living now except this time on my own family, that the year I was told we needed to be careful, my parents had paid for Emily's competitive dance team registration, her costumes, and a week-long dance camp in Michigan, a combined total of just under $3,000. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for a childhood disappointment about a coding class. I'm telling you because it was never really about the coding class. It was about learning, slowly and repeatedly, that my needs were a line item to be trimmed, and Emily's needs were C. Imply the budget. When I turned 16, my parents bought Emily, who was 12 at the time, a horse. An actual horse, boarded at a stable 40 minutes from our house, because she had cried at a friend's birthday party where there were pony rides and decided she needed one of her own. I got my first car that same year, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield that I paid for myself with money I'd saved from 2 years of babysitting and a part-time job at a frozen yogurt shop. My father helped me change the oil in that car exactly once. He drove out to the stable to help Emily's horse adjust to its new home almost every weekend for a year. There was a specific evening, the fall I was 17, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from that house. I had made the National Honor Society, and more than that, I'd been chosen to give a short speech at the induction ceremony because I'd had the highest weighted GPA in my class that semester. I told my parents about it 3 separate times over the course of a week, each time watching my mother nod and say something like, "That's nice, honey," while continuing to fold laundry or scroll through her phone. On the night of the ceremony, my father called from the hardware store to say he was working late and couldn't make it, and my mother said she felt a migraine coming on and asked if I could just tell her about it afterward. I sat in the school auditorium that night in a row with 2 empty seats beside me, gave my speech to a room full of other families, and drove myself home afterward. When I walked in the door around 9, my parents were in the living room with Emily, who was 13, watching her run through a dance routine she'd choreographed for an upcoming recital. My mother's migraine had apparently resolved itself. Nobody asked how the ceremony went. I stood in the doorway for almost a full minute before my father glanced over and said, "Oh, hey, how'd that thing go?" already turning back to Emily's routine before I could answer. There was another incident, a few years later, that I think about almost as often, maybe because it was so small on its surface and so large underneath. I was 15, and I had spent an entire semester saving allowance and babysitting money to buy myself a decent pair of running shoes, because I'd joined the cross-country team and my old sneakers were falling apart at the seams. I finally had enough, $94, and I asked my mother if she could drive me to the sporting goods store on a Saturday. She said she would, and then that Saturday morning, Emily woke up in tears because a girl at her dance studio had been chosen for a solo she wanted. And by 10 in the morning, my mother had rearranged the entire day around taking Emily out for ice cream and a new leotard to, in her words, cheer her up. My trip to the shoe store got pushed to the following weekend, and then the weekend after that, until cross-country season was nearly half over and I was still running in shoes with a hole worn through the side. I never did get driven to that store. I eventually took a bus downtown by myself on a Tuesday after school and bought the shoes alone, and I remember feeling, at 15, a strange kind of pride in having solved the problem myself, mixed with something heavier that I couldn't quite name yet. A sense that in my house, my disappointments simply didn't generate the same urgency as my sisters did. College applications brought their own version of this pattern, and looking back, this is probably the incident that hurt the most, because by then I was old enough to understand exactly what was happening while it happened, rather than only piecing it together years later. I had been accepted, at 17, into an accelerated business and accounting program at a university 2 states away, a genuinely competitive program that I'd worked toward for 3 years, and I remember sitting my parents down at the kitchen table with the acceptance letter and a financial aid breakdown, hoping for some acknowledgement of what I'd accomplished. My father looked over the numbers, the portion we'd still be responsible for after aid and scholarships, and said, gently but firmly, that it was more than they could commit to right now, especially with Emily's dance training ramping up for regional competitions that same year. I ended up attending Ohio State instead, commuting from home for the first 2 years to save money, while that same year, Emily's competition fees, costume commissions, and a private coach who charged $80 an hour came to, by my own later calculations going through old records, just over $11,000. I don't say this to diminish what mattered to my sister. Dance mattered to her the way accounting mattered to me. I say it because the money was never actually the constraint. The constraint was always which of us the money was for. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching who has lived through some version of this. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being physically present in a room full of people who love you, technically, and still feeling completely invisible. It doesn't leave bruises. nobody can point to a single moment and call it abuse. It's the accumulation that does the damage, the way water eventually carves a canyon out of solid rock, not through force but through relentless repetition. I didn't have a name for it back then. I just had a growing, quiet certainty that in my own family, I was the supporting character, and Emily was the star. I think about a family vacation, too, the summer I was 14, that crystallizes this pattern in a way that still surprises me with how vividly I remember it. We'd planned a week at a lake house in Michigan, the first real family vacation we'd taken in years, and I had been genuinely excited about it, mostly because I'd just discovered a passion for photography and had saved up to buy a used camera specifically to document the trip. On the second day, Emily, then 10, twisted her ankle running along the dock. Nothing serious. The doctor at the local urgent care confirmed it was a mild sprain, but the entire remaining 5 days of the trip reorganized itself around her recovery. We didn't take the hiking trail I'd been looking forward to. We didn't rent the kayaks I'd read about online for weeks beforehand. Instead, we sat on the lake house porch while Emily, propped up with her foot elevated on a stack of couch cushions, was brought lemonade and attention, and a rotating cast of board games. And I spent most of that week taking photographs of a vacation that had essentially stopped happening for me the moment my sister's ankle gave a mild twinge. I didn't say anything at the time. I don't think I had the vocabulary for what I was feeling yet, only a familiar, heavy quiet that had already become second nature to me by then. Looking back at those photographs years later, what strikes me most isn't the missing hiking trail or the unused kayaks. It's how many of the pictures are of Emily, smiling on that porch, and how few are of me, because nobody, that whole week, thought to turn the camera around. There is one more piece of my childhood I need to tell you about, because it becomes important later, and it has nothing to do with dance recitals or birthday cakes. It has to do with my grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, my father's mother. My grandmother owned a small chain of 3 family restaurants across the Columbus area called Eleanor's Table, which she and my grandfather had built from a single diner in the 1970s into a modest but genuinely profitable local institution by the time I was born. My grandfather passed away when I was 6, and my grandmother ran the business alone for the next 2 decades, sharp as anyone I've ever known, right up until she passed when I was 26. My grandmother and I had a relationship that was different from anything else in my family. She was the one person who seemed to actually see me. When I was young, she'd take me to the restaurants on weekends and let me sit in the back office while she went through the books, explaining margins and payroll and vendor contracts to a girl who was maybe 10 years old, because I asked questions and I actually listened to the answers. She used to say I had the head for it, meaning the business, in a way that neither my father nor Emily ever did. My father worked at the hardware store his whole adult life and had never shown interest in running the restaurants. Emily, by the time she was old enough to have opinions about it, was focused entirely on a dance career that never quite materialized into anything beyond local recital circuits and a brief stint teaching classes at a studio. I want to be precise about something here because it matters enormously to what comes later. My grandmother never once, in front of my parents or Emily, indicated that she saw me any differently than she saw them. She was careful, deliberate, private. But over the last 5 years of her life, as her health declined and she began thinking seriously about what would happen to Eleanor's Table after she was gone, she and I had a series of quiet, separate conversations, usually over coffee at her kitchen table, just the 2 of us, that the rest of my family never knew about. She told me, about 4 years before she died, that she was restructuring the ownership of the business through a trust, and that she intended for me to hold majority control, 51%, with the remaining shares split between my father and Emily in a way that let them draw income from the restaurants without having any real say in how they were run. Her reasoning, which she explained to me directly, was simple, and frankly, a little devastating in its honesty. She said my father had never wanted to run anything in his life, and that giving him controlling ownership would just mean the business slowly declined through neglect until someone had to sell it off. She said Emily had never shown the discipline the business required, and handing her control would be setting her up to fail publicly in a way that would hurt everyone. And she said that I was the only person in the family who had both the financial literacy and the temperament to protect what she and my grandfather had spent their lives building. I remember one particular afternoon with unusual clarity, the spring I was 24, sitting across from her at that same worn kitchen table where she'd once taught me to read a profit and loss statement as a child. She'd just come from a doctor's appointment and had a folder of paperwork from her attorney sitting between us, and she tapped it twice before sliding it toward me. She told me that she had watched, for years, quietly, the way I moved through the world, careful, precise, uncomplaining, and that she worried, even as she admired it, that I had learned to expect too little for myself. "You've got the head for this business, Rachel," she said. "But more than that, you've got the spine for it, and I've watched your father and your sister my whole life, and neither of them has ever had to develop one, because somebody always smoothed the road in front of them." She told me she didn't want the restaurants to become another thing that got smoothed over for people who hadn't earned it, and that she trusted me, specifically because I had never once asked her for anything, to be the one who protected it. I remember not knowing what to say. I just nodded, and she patted my hand, and we didn't discuss it again for almost a year, until the actual trust paperwork was ready to sign. She asked me not to tell anyone, including my parents, while she was alive. She said she didn't want her final years to be full of arguments about money, and she trusted that when the time came, the paperwork would speak for itself. I honored that request completely. I never once brought it up, not even to hint at it, in the 2 years between that conversation and her death. When she passed, the will and trust documents were handled quietly through her estate attorney, and because the ownership was structured through a trust rather than a simple inheritance, and because my grandmother had specifically instructed her attorney to keep the details from being read aloud in a family gathering the way people do in movies, my parents and Emily never learned the specifics. They knew the restaurants continued operating under family ownership. They knew they each received a modest quarterly distribution from what they believed was a jointly and roughly equally held family asset. My father, in particular, operated for years afterward under the assumption that ownership had simply passed to the family, in some vague, collective sense, the same way it always had. He never asked to see the trust documents. It never occurred to him that he should. That is, I've come to understand, one of the quieter forms of privilege that runs through families like mine. The assumption that things will simply continue to work in your favor, so thoroughly ingrained that you never think to check. My grandmother's funeral, 8 years ago now, is a day I still think about often in the context of everything that happened later. It was a small service, just family and a handful of longtime regulars from the restaurants who insisted on attending, and I remember standing at the back of the funeral home afterward while my father and Emily accepted condolences near the front, both of them, understandably, overwhelmed with grief in their own ways. I stood there with the folder of trust paperwork already sitting in my car, information that would reshape how this family understood itself, and I said nothing, because it wasn't the day for it, and because my grandmother herself had asked for exactly that kind of restraint. If you've ever had to carry a piece of knowledge that would change how people saw you, but chosen to wait, out of respect or grief or simple timing, for the right moment to share it, let me know in the comments, because I think that particular kind of patience is more common and more exhausting than people realize. I finished my accounting degree at Ohio State, went on to get my CPA and later a certification in forensic accounting, and built my career carefully and deliberately over the following decade, largely independent of my family's day-to-day awareness. I moved 40 minutes away to Westerville. I came to Sunday dinners most weeks, dutifully, because despite everything I've described, I still loved my parents and still wanted, on some stubborn level I couldn't quite talk myself out of, for things between us to feel normal. Emily and I had what I would call a cordial but distant relationship, cordial in the way two people are when the family structure requires it, distant because we had genuinely never been close. 3 years ago, I met a man named Daniel Ferris at a conference on financial fraud prevention, of all places, where he was presenting on cybersecurity for community banks. Daniel is an IT security consultant, thoughtful and steady in a way that felt entirely new to me after years of a family dynamic built on being overlooked. We dated for 2 years, and 18 months ago, he proposed, and I said yes without a single moment of hesitation, which is not something I can say about most decisions in my life. We set our wedding date for the second Saturday in October, at a restored barn venue about an hour outside Columbus, and we began planning almost a year in advance, the way you do when you're trying to get everything right. I sent my parents and Emily a save-the-date card in January. I called my mother personally to confirm the date, twice, once in February and again in June, specifically because some cautious, well-worn part of me had learned, over 3 decades, not to assume that anything involving me would automatically register as a priority. In late July, about 10 weeks before my wedding, Emily got engaged to her boyfriend of 2 years, a man named Marcus who worked in commercial real estate. I want to say clearly that I was genuinely happy for her. Whatever the imbalance in her upbringing, I never wished my sister ill, and I called her the night she told her I was thrilled, asked to see the ring, meant every word of it. The problem arrived 3 weeks later, when Emily and Marcus decided to host their engagement party on the exact same Saturday as my wedding. I found out not from a phone call, but from a group text my mother sent to a family chat that included me, my father, Emily, and a handful of aunts and uncles, announcing the date and location of Emily and Marcus's engagement celebration, with 3 exclamation points and a string of ring emojis. I stared at that message for a long time before I responded, because surely, I thought, this was an oversight. Surely my mother, who had watched me plan my wedding for the better part of a year, who had the date sitting in her own calendar, because I had confirmed it with her twice, had simply made a scheduling error that would be corrected within the hour once someone noticed. I called her immediately. I said, as calmly as I could manage, "Mom, that's my wedding date, October 11th. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then my mother said, in a tone that I can only describe as mildly inconvenienced, "Oh, I know, honey, but Emily already booked the venue, and it was the only weekend they could get before Marcus's work trip to Singapore in November. And honestly, I figured you two could just, work it out between yourselves." Work it out between ourselves. As if my wedding, a full year in planning, 120 guests, a deposit on a venue I couldn't get back, was a scheduling conflict on the same tier as 2 friends trying to pick a lunch spot. I asked Emily to move her party. She said she'd already sent invitations. I offered genuinely, generously, more generously than I now believe I owed her, to move my own wedding, and my venue coordinator informed me that the barn had no other autumn Saturdays available that year, and moving to a different venue entirely, 10 weeks out, would mean losing my deposit and likely losing several vendors who were already booked. I explained all of this to my mother. I explained it to my father. I explained it, with as much composure as I could hold on to Emily herself, over the phone, on a call that ended with her saying, "I really don't see why this has to be such a big deal, Rachel, you're being kind of dramatic." If you've made it this far and any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had a family member tell you that your milestone is somehow the dramatic one, while their competing milestone is simply an unavoidable fact of scheduling, drop a comment with the phrase, "I know that feeling." Because I promise you, you are not alone, and there are more of us than you'd think. In the weeks between that first phone call and the wedding itself, I made 3 separate attempts to find some version of a compromise, because even then, even after everything, I still wanted to believe this was solvable if I just tried hard enough. I offered to cover the cost difference if Emily wanted to move her party to a Friday evening instead, so guests could attend both events across a single weekend. Emily said Friday didn't work because Marcus's parents were flying in from Arizona and could only do Saturday. I offered to move my own ceremony time earlier in the day, to noon, so that family could theoretically attend the first half of my wedding and still make it to Emily's party by early evening. My mother said that felt rushed and weird for a wedding, and that she didn't think it was fair to ask our extended family to split their day like that. I even, in a moment I'm not entirely proud of because it required more restraint than I usually have to spare, asked my father directly, just the 2 of us, on a phone call in early September, whether he could simply attend my wedding and let my mother go to Emily's party, so that at least one parent would be present for each of us. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother would never forgive me for missing Emily's big day, and honestly, Rachel, I think you're strong enough to handle this one without us there the way Emily might not be." I didn't have a response to that. I don't think there was one. By late September, with 2 weeks to go, I stopped asking. I threw myself instead into finishing the wedding with the people who had already made clear they intended to be there, my future in-laws, Daniel's brother who flew in from Seattle, my college roommate who drove 5 hours from Pittsburgh, and that uncle on my mother's side, my Uncle Pete, who called me the week before the wedding just to ask what time the ceremony started, because, he said, somebody from this family needs to walk you down that aisle, and it looks like it's going to be me. In the end, nothing changed. My parents attended Emily's engagement party. So did my aunts, my uncles, most of my extended family, and a dozen or so of my parents' longtime friends who had known me my entire life. Not one of them came to my wedding. My mother sent a card 2 days before with a check for $200 tucked inside, and a note that read, "Sorry we can't be there. We know you understand. Love you both." My father didn't send anything at all. He called me the week of, not to apologize, but to ask if I could maybe stop by Emily's party for a bit that afternoon before your own thing. As though my wedding were a minor evening appointment I could squeeze around my sister's celebration. I did not go to Emily's engagement party. I got married on October 11th at 4 in the afternoon, in a barn strung with string lights, in front of 120 people, most of them Daniel's family and our closest friends, walked down the aisle by an uncle on my mother's side who had driven 6 hours because, in his words, family shows up. My own parents and my only sibling were 40 minutes away, drinking champagne under a rented tent, toasting a ring, while I said my vows without them in the room. Daniel noticed something that day that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Late that night, after the guests had gone and we were sitting on the tailgate of his truck in the gravel lot behind the barn, still in my wedding dress with my shoes kicked off somewhere in the grass, he said quietly, "You know, I watched you all night, and you didn't look sad once. You looked like someone who finally stopped waiting for permission to be happy." I hadn't thought of it in those terms before, but he was right. For years, some part of me had held my own joy a little at arm's length, as if fully claiming it required my family's approval first, a kind of unconscious deference that had nothing to do with Daniel and everything to do with 3 decades of training. Standing at the front of that barn without them, I hadn't felt the absence the way I expected to. I had felt, for maybe the first time in my adult life, entirely present in my own celebration, without half my attention reserved for whether anyone else was satisfied with it. I will not pretend that day wasn't painful. It was, in a way I'm still not sure I've fully processed even now. But I want to tell you something important about that day too, because this isn't a story about wallowing. My Uncle Pete, true to his word, arrived at the venue 2 hours early that day, dressed in a suit he told me he'd had tailored specifically for the occasion, and he spent nearly an hour with me in the small room where I was getting ready, not saying much, just being present in the specific, steady way some people know how to be without needing to fill silence with anything. At one point, adjusting my veil, he said, "You know, your grandma would have been furious about all this, the party thing, the missing wedding. She didn't raise her son to let his daughter get overlooked like this." I hadn't expected to hear my grandmother mentioned that morning, and it caught me somewhere tender, because in all the chaos of the previous 10 weeks, I hadn't fully let myself grieve the specific ache of not having her there, the one person in my family who had always, without fail, made me feel seen. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, also drove in that morning from 2 hours away, having heard about the scheduling conflict through the family grapevine, and having made her own quiet decision about where she belonged that day. She cried through most of the ceremony, she told me afterward, not out of sadness, but out of a kind of fierce, protective pride, the sense that at least somebody from that side of the family had shown up early. Standing at the front of that barn, looking out at a room full of people who had chosen, actively and without hesitation, to be there for me, I felt something shift. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity. For years, I had operated on the quiet hope that if I just kept showing up, kept being patient, kept being the reasonable one, my family would eventually notice me the way they noticed Emily. That day, I understood with a kind of calm finality that this was never going to happen through hoping. And for the first time, I let myself think seriously about what I actually held, and what I owed people who had spent 3 decades treating my life as an afterthought. I didn't do anything rash. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next wasn't an act of anger. It was simply a decision to stop protecting people from information that was, honestly, theirs to have all along, and mine to finally stop shielding them from. For 6 years, since my grandmother's death, I had quietly and deliberately kept Aliner's table financially stable, mostly behind the scenes, in ways my family never fully understood. The three restaurants had struggled during the early pandemic years like most restaurants had, and I had personally, through the trust I controlled, authorized two separate infusions of capital to keep all three locations open and all 31 employees on payroll, totaling just under $210,000 over 3 years, structured as loans from the trust back to the operating business, at low interest, with flexible repayment terms that I never enforced. My father, who managed the day-to-day operations of the flagship location on weekends alongside his job at the hardware store, believed this money had simply come from the business doing okay and reserves my grandmother had left behind. He had no idea that reserve had run dry in year two and that everything since had come directly from me. I had also, 18 months earlier, quietly paid off the remaining balance on my parents' mortgage, a little over $68,000, after learning through a conversation with my mother, who had no idea I understood exactly what she was describing, that they had fallen behind during a rough stretch when my father's hours at the hardware store were cut. I did this through the same trust structure, technically as a loan secured against the property, at my attorney's recommendation, rather than an outright gift, mostly for tax and estate planning reasons. My parents believed, because I let them believe it, that a refinance through their credit union had solved the problem. They had no idea I held the actual lien. None of this was a secret out of malice. I want to be honest about my own reasoning here because I've thought about it a great deal since. Part of it was my grandmother's original request for discretion, which I felt bound to honor even after her death. Part of it, if I'm being fully truthful, was a lingering hope, even after everything, that my family would come to appreciate me on their own, without needing to be shown a balance sheet. I didn't want love or attention that felt like it was purchased with disclosure. I wanted it freely given. I had been waiting, I realize now, for a version of my family that was never going to arrive on its own. The wedding changed that calculation. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood that discretion had curdled, over time, into something closer to self-erasure, and that the people I was protecting from this information were the same people who had spent 30 years demonstrating, repeatedly and without much subtlety, that they did not extend me the same consideration. The 6 weeks between my wedding and that Sunday dinner in November were, in their own quiet way, some of the most clarifying of my adult life. Daniel and I settled into our first weeks as a married couple in the townhouse we'd bought together in Westerville, and I found myself, for the first time in years, actually examining the shape of my own life rather than simply managing around my family's expectations of it. I spent time going back through old financial records, not out of any plotted intention to use them, but because that is simply how I process things, the way another person might journal or go for long walks. I pulled up the original trust documents my grandmother's attorney had drafted. I reviewed the payment history on the loans I'd extended to the restaurant. I really looked, at the recorded lien on my parents' house, the one they didn't know I held, and I sat with a question I hadn't let myself ask directly before. Why was I still protecting people from information that, if anything, should have made them treat me with more consideration rather than less? I didn't arrive at an answer that pushed me towards some dramatic unveiling. I simply arrived at a quieter willingness, for the first time, to stop actively managing the islands if the truth ever happened to surface on its own. The reveal, when it came, wasn't something I planned with any theatrical intent. It arrived, almost accidentally, 6 weeks after my wedding, at a Sunday dinner in November that my mother had specifically framed as getting the family back together, after what she called all that wedding business. I went. Daniel came with me, quietly supportive, having watched the whole wedding situation unfold with a level of controlled frustration on my behalf that I appreciated more than I could say. Emily and Marcus were there too, along with my parents, at the same dining room table I'd eaten at my entire childhood. Partway through dinner, my father, who had clearly had a glass of wine and a half, started talking, with visible excitement, about a plan he and Emily had apparently been discussing for weeks. He wanted to open a fourth Aliner's Table location, in a new development going up near Polaris, and he wanted to put Emily, who had recently left her teaching position at the dance studio and was, in her words, figuring out her next chapter, in charge of running it. He talked about renovation costs, about a construction loan he was planning to pursue through the restaurant's business line of credit, about how this could really be Emily's thing, finally, in a tone that made it clear this had been decided, discussed, and largely finalized without a single word to me, despite the fact that I held majority ownership of the very entity he was describing. I sat there and listened, and I felt something settle in me, cold and clear, not angry exactly, more like the particular calm that comes right before you say something you've been holding for a very long time. I asked, evenly, who authorized the construction loan application. My father waved a hand and said something about how he'd been in touch with the same loan officer at the bank who had helped with the mortgage stuff a while back, and that he was just waiting on paperwork. I asked which mortgage stuff. He said, a little impatiently, the refinance from a couple years ago, the one that had gotten them out of that rough patch. I asked him, directly, if he actually remembered the name of the institution that had refinanced it. He paused. I watched something flicker across his face, the first small crack of uncertainty, because of course he didn't remember, because there had never been a refinance at all. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed on the table beside my plate. It was a text from my attorney, whom I had been in contact with that week, finalizing an unrelated matter regarding the trust's annual filings, confirming that the documentation I'd requested, the full trust ownership records for Aliner's table and the recorded lien on my parents' property, had been prepared and sent to my email as I'd asked, in case I ever needed to produce them. My phone was face up. My father, sitting directly across from me, reached over without thinking, the way people do in families where boundaries around phones had never been particularly respected, and picked it up to see who was texting during what he considered a family conversation. He read the message aloud before I could stop him, in the slightly performative voice he sometimes used to tease me about being married to my job, clearly expecting it to be something mundane. Rachel, confirming the trust ownership documents for Aliner's table, 51% controlling interest, and the recorded lien on the Larkspur Lane property, $68,200, are attached as requested. Let me know if you need these for Sunday. Janet. The table went completely silent. My father read it twice, I think, the second time under his breath, as though rereading it might change what it said. Emily's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My mother set down her wine glass with a small, careful click, the kind of controlled movement people make when they're trying very hard not to visibly react. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for the phone in some dramatic gesture. I simply said, yes, that's accurate. I hold 51% of Aliner's table through the trust Grandma set up before she died, and I hold the lien on this house because I paid off the mortgage 2 years ago when you two fell behind. I never told either of you because I didn't think it should matter to how we treated each other. I've been covering shortfalls at the restaurant for 3 years. I paid off this house. And this is the first time either of you has asked me a single question about the business you're planning to expand, using a line of credit that legally requires my signature to access. My father's face went through several distinct stages of disbelief, then something that looked almost like anger, quickly followed by a kind of dawning, uncomfortable math, the same math I imagined he should have been doing for years and never had. That's not possible, he said. Mom would have told me I'm her son. She told me not to tell you, I said. She made that decision, not me. I honored it. I've honored it for 6 years, through paying off $210,000 in losses at the restaurant and $68,000 on this house, while also apparently not being important enough to be told about a construction loan against a business I actually control. Emily, to her credit, was the first one to say something coherent. Wait, she said slowly, looking between me and our father, you own the restaurants. Like actually own them, not just like a piece. I own the majority, I said. Enough that nothing significant happens with that business without my signature. Including, as it turns out, a construction loan for a 4th location that I was never once consulted about. My mother, who had been quiet through all of this, finally spoke, and her voice had an edge I'd rarely heard directed at me before, somewhere between accusation and disbelief. Why wouldn't you tell us this, Rachel? All this time, letting us think, letting your father think. I didn't let anyone think anything, I said. And this is the part I want anyone watching to really hear, because I said it as calmly as I could. but I meant every word with everything I had. I paid off a mortgage you never told me you were struggling with because you were embarrassed to ask me directly, and I let you save face by handling it quietly instead of making you sit through an uncomfortable conversation. I kept a family restaurant open through a pandemic because 31 people needed their paychecks, and Dad had no idea reserves were gone. I did all of that without asking for a single thing in return, without a thank you, without even acknowledgement, because I didn't think love should come with a receipt. And 6 weeks ago, every single person at this table chose my sister's engagement party over my wedding, and nobody so much as sent a proper apology afterward. So forgive me if I'm having some difficulty right now feeling guilty about not disclosing my financial situation to people who couldn't be bothered to disclose their calendar conflict to me a year in advance. My father set the phone down on the table slowly, like it had suddenly become fragile. $210,000, he repeated, almost to himself, staring at the tablecloth rather than at me. Over 3 years, that's what you're telling me. That's what I'm telling you, I said. Split across 3 separate infusions, in 2020, 2021, and 2022, structured as internal loans from the trust, at 2% interest, none of which has been repaid, and none of which I've asked to be repaid, because that was never the point of doing it. Why didn't you just tell me the restaurant needed help? He asked, and there was real hurt in his voice now, not just shock. I could have picked up more shifts. I could have found a way. Dad, you were already picking up every shift the hardware store would give you, I said, and I meant this gently because whatever else was true, I did understand that he had genuinely tried in the ways he knew how. There wasn't a version of you working more hours that covered a $200,000 gap. I had the money. I had the structure Grandma set up specifically so that someone could step in without the whole business collapsing. I used it. I didn't tell you because telling you felt like it would just be one more thing for you to carry. And because, honestly, some part of me kept waiting to see if anyone would ask the right questions on their own. Emily set her fork down entirely at that point and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to genuine reassessment than I was used to receiving from my own sister. So this whole time, she said slowly, while I've been telling people I'm figuring out my next chapter, you've basically been keeping the actual family business alive. And nobody knew. And you never said anything. Not even when Mom and Dad picked my engagement party over your wedding. Not even then, I said. That's insane, she said, and I couldn't tell, in the moment, whether she meant it as an accusation or as something closer to awe. Why would you let us do that to you if you had, actual leverage this whole time? Because leverage was never what I wanted to use it for, I said. I didn't help this family to build a case against you. I did it because I loved you, all of you, and I thought love that keeps score isn't really love. But I'm standing here right now realizing that keeping score and simply expecting basic decency are two very different things, and I let myself confuse them for a long time. My mother, who had been sitting rigidly with her hands folded in her lap since the phone had first buzzed, finally spoke again, quieter this time. I don't understand how we didn't know any of this, she said. How does a Our son just not know that their own daughter owns the family business? You didn't know, I said, because nobody ever asked. Not about the trust, not about the restaurant's finances, not about how the mortgage actually got handled. This family has a long history of not asking me questions, and I think, if we're being honest tonight, that's really what this is about. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Daniel reached over and put his hand over mine on the table, not to stop me, just to let me know he was there. Marcus looked deeply, visibly uncomfortable, the way anyone would feel walking into a family reckoning 6 weeks into an engagement. Emily was staring at her plate. My father looked, for the first time in my adult memory, genuinely small. I told them, before I left that night, exactly what would happen going forward, because I had, by that point, thought it through with the same clarity I bring to any complex financial situation. I told my father that any loan application against the business's line of credit would require my review and signature going forward, as it always technically had, and that I would not be authorizing a construction loan for a 4th location, not out of spite, but because the existing 3 locations were still recovering and taking on new debt for an unproven manager, however much they loved her, was not sound financially. I told him I intended to formalize proper governance structures for the trust, quarterly reporting, an actual operating agreement, the kind of basic corporate housekeeping that should have existed from the start, so that decisions about the business could no longer happen the way they'd been happening, informally, around a family dinner table, based on who was in the room rather than who actually held the authority. I told my parents that the lien on the house would remain in place, that I had no intention of calling in the loan or putting them at any risk, but that I would also no longer be quietly absorbing surprise expenses without a conversation first. And I told all of them plainly that going forward, I expected to be included, actually included, in decisions that affected assets I controlled, not informed after the fact, not asked to simply work it out, when my own life collided with someone else's plans. The weeks that followed were not easy for anyone, and I think it's important to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where everything resolves into a neat bow within a single dramatic dinner scene. My father, for the first time, had to sit with the reality that the business he'd spent years assuming was collectively his in some vague sense had never actually been structured that way, and that his own mother had made a deliberate, considered choice about who among her children and grandchildren she trusted to protect what she'd built. That was a hard thing for him to metabolize, and I understood that, even as I didn't feel particularly inclined to soften it for him. He asked to see the full trust documents, and I sent them to him within the week, because I had never wanted to hide anything out of malice, only out of respect for my grandmother's original wishes, and, if I'm honest, out of my own long-standing habit of not asking for credit. He spent most of December quieter than I'd ever known him to be, and my mother told me, in one of our early careful conversations, that she'd found him sitting alone in the restaurant's back office more than once, going through old ledgers my grandmother had kept by hand for decades, as though he were trying to find, retroactively, some sign he'd missed of what she'd actually thought of him. In January, he asked me, somewhat awkwardly, over the phone, whether I'd be willing to walk him through how the trust's finances actually worked, in plain terms, the way Grandma used to walk me through them at that same kitchen table. I said yes. We started meeting every other Sunday afternoon at the flagship restaurant, just the two of us, going over vendor invoices and labor schedules, and the actual margin on a plate of pot roast after food costs, and it has become, unexpectedly, one of the more meaningful relationships I've built with my father in years. He is 61 years old and learning, for the first time in his adult life, how the business he's worked around for 3 decades actually functions, and there is something almost moving about watching a person start over that late, with that much humility. I think often, during those Sunday afternoon meetings, about how right my grandmother turned out to be, not in some smug, told-you-so way, but in a way that makes me understand her final years a little differently now. She wasn't trying to punish my father by withholding control from him. She'd watched him for 6 decades and understood, with a clarity I don't think he'd ever turned on himself, that he'd never once had to develop the muscles that running something requires, because Ife had never demanded it of him the way it eventually demanded it of me. She wasn't choosing me over him out of favoritism. She was choosing the person who had already, by necessity, learned to carry weight without being asked, because nobody had ever offered to carry it for me. There's something almost sad in that realization, that the very neglect which shaped my childhood was the same quality my grandmother eventually recognized as strength. But there's something redemptive in it too, watching that strength finally get to do some good for the people who overlooked where it came from. I've thought too about what I'll do differently if Daniel and I have children of our own someday. I don't say this to suggest my parents were monsters, because they weren't, and I don't think most families that fall into this pattern are made up of monsters either. They're usually just tired, distracted people, doing their best with whatever squeaky wheel happens to be loudest in a given season, and not realizing, until it's cost them something significant, how much damage accumulates in the quiet children who never learn to squeak. If I ever find myself with 2 kids, one who needs everything spelled out, and one who seems to simply manage on her own, I hope I remember this story, my story, and ask myself honestly whether the quiet one is actually fine, or whether she's simply gotten very good at appearing that way. If you've made it this far, I want to check in with you again, because this next part is where the story really shows its true shape, not in the dramatic reveal itself, but in the slow, unglamorous work of what came after. If you've ever wondered what actually happens in the weeks after a family confrontation like this, once the shock wears off and everybody has to go back to their actual lives, stay with me, because I think that part matters more than the dinner table scene ever could. The construction loan for the fourth location did not move forward. Without it, and without my father's full understanding of how thin the business's margins actually were, he had a difficult conversation with Emily about what her thing could realistically look like, at least for now. And Emily, to her genuine credit, took a job managing operations at the flagship Aliner's Table location instead, starting from the actual ground floor, learning inventory and scheduling and vendor relationships the slow way. The way I once watched our grandmother teach me at that same kitchen table decades earlier. It has not been glamorous for her, and there have been weeks where she's called me, a little humbled, asking questions about margins and labor costs that she'd never had to think about before, and I have answered every one of them, because helping her build real competence was never something I wanted to withhold. What I wasn't willing to do anymore was hand her authority she hadn't earned, funded by debt I hadn't approved, decided in a conversation I hadn't been part of. The first few months were genuinely difficult for her, in ways I don't think she'd anticipated when she agreed to take the position. She'd spent most of her 20s being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she had a natural gift for leading, whether it was choreographing routines for younger dancers or organizing recital logistics that other people happily deferred to her on, and she arrived at the restaurant, I think, expecting some version of that same instinctive authority to translate immediately. It didn't. She scheduled 2 servers on a Friday night that historically needed 4, and the kitchen fell a full hour behind on tickets, while regular customers sat waiting for entrees that should have come out in 20 minutes. She ordered produce for a menu special that never actually sold well, and watched, for the first time in her life, an actual dollar amount of waste get written off at the end of the month with her name attached to the order. I remember a phone call in February where she was nearly in tears, not because anyone had yelled at her, but because she'd realized, on her own, sitting with a spreadsheet at 11 at night, that competence wasn't a thing you were simply given credit for having. It was a thing you built slowly, usually while getting quite a lot of it wrong first. I told her what our grandmother used to tell me, back when I was the one making the mistakes at that same kitchen table, that the restaurant business forgives almost anything except pretending you already know what you're doing. Ask the question, write down the answer. Ask it again in 6 months if you need to. She took that seriously, more seriously than I expected, honestly, and by early summer, the flagship location's labor costs had come down almost 4 percentage points from where they'd been the previous year, not because she'd cut corners, but because she'd actually learned to read a schedule the way it needed to be read. My father tells me now, with a kind of qui. Et pride, I don't think he's expressed about either of us very often before, that customers have started asking for her by name when they call in for reservations. My parents put the house on the market that spring and downsized into a smaller condo about 15 minutes from their old neighborhood, a decision my father framed, initially, as unrelated to anything that had happened, though the math told a clearer story. With the liens still outstanding, and their retirement savings thinner than either of them had let on, it made more sense to free up equity than to keep carrying a house that size on a hardware store assistant manager's income. I didn't push them toward that decision. I simply stopped absorbing the gap that had let them avoid it. In the days immediately following that dinner, my phone stayed unusually quiet, which was, in its own way, its own kind of information. There was no group text the next morning smoothing things over, no attempt to fold the previous night back into normalcy, the way this family had always folded difficult things away before. My mother called 2 days later, her voice careful, mostly to ask logistical questions about the trust paperwork rather than to address what had actually happened, and I answered them plainly, without warmth but without coldness either, simply the professional clarity I'd bring to any client relationship. My father didn't call for almost a full week, and when he finally did, it was a short, halting conversation in which he mostly apologized, repeatedly, in slightly different phrasings, as though he were still searching for the specific words that might undo 10 weeks of hurt in a single call. I told him, gently, that an apology wasn't really what I needed from him right then. What I needed was time, and consistency, and the chance to see whether anything would actually be different going forward, or whether this would simply become another difficult evening that got smoothed over and quietly forgot, the way so many difficult evenings in our family always had before. Marcus, for his part, had a harder adjustment than almost anyone expected, including Emily herself. He came from a family with real money, the kind of commercial real estate wealth that meant he'd grown up assuming financial matters were handled quietly and competently by people who knew what they were doing, and I think the dinner that night rattled something in him that had nothing to do with me directly. He pulled Emily aside in the kitchen before they left that evening, and she told me weeks later that he'd asked her, gently but seriously, whether she'd known any of this, whether she'd been part of a family that let a sibling absorb that much financial responsibility while planning a fourth restaurant on borrowed money nobody had properly accounted for. Emily told him honestly that she hadn't known, that she'd been as blindsided as he was, and I think, in an odd way, that shared shock became one of the first genuinely honest conversations the two of them had as a couple, rather than the performative ease of an engagement still in its early, photogenic months. Their wedding, which took place the following June, was smaller than originally planned and considerably more modest, a choice Emily told me she made partly because, in her words, "I don't want to build my marriage the way this family built everything else, on assuming somebody else will just make it work." I was there for that wedding, seated near the front, and Emily asked me, a few weeks before, whether I would say a few words during the reception. I almost said no, out of some old reflex of not wanting to make her day about me, before catching myself and realizing that reflex was exactly the pattern I'd spent the last year trying to unlearn. I said yes, and I kept it short, 3 or 4 sentences about watching my sister grow into someone who asked real questions instead of assuming answers, and when I sat down afterward, she reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and neither of us needed to say anything else about it. My relationship with my mother took the longest to find any kind of new footing. For months, there was a formality between us that hadn't existed before, not exactly cold, but careful, the way people are with each other after a long-buried disagreement finally surfaces. It was Daniel, actually, who told me something that stuck with me during that stretch, that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for a relationship is stop managing it around other people's comfort and let it be honestly uncomfortable for a while, because the discomfort is actually where the real conversation lives. My mother and I had that real conversation, eventually, over coffee, just the two of us, in March. She told me she hadn't fully understood, until that dinner, how much of her own daughter's life she had simply stopped paying attention to somewhere along the way, and that the wedding hadn't been a scheduling oversight so much as a reflex, 3 decades deep, of assuming I would be fine either way. I don't know that I've fully forgiven that reflex, but I believe she meant what she said, and we are, slowly, rebuilding something that at least has honesty in it now, which is more than I could say for most of my life before that dinner. She told me something else that day, over that coffee, that I haven't been able to shake since. She said that when Emily was born 4 years after me, she had gone through a hard postpartum stretch, harder than she'd ever told anyone at the time, and that some instinct in her had decided, without her ever consciously choosing it, that Emily was the child who needed extra watching, extra softness, extra protecting, while I, even as a small child, had always seemed to her like someone who could simply manage. "Never cried much as a baby," she said, "and I think I mistook that for you not needing as much, instead of understanding that maybe you just learned, somehow impossibly young, not to bother." I didn't know what to do with that information, honestly, except to sit with it. It didn't undo 30 years. But it gave me something I hadn't had before, which was an actual reason, rather than just an absence, and sometimes an honest reason is the only kind of repair that's actually available. We still have moments of friction. My mother sent a group text in the spring inviting the whole family to Easter at her new condo, and out of what I genuinely believe was habit rather than intent, listed the time as overlapping with a baby shower for one of Emily's friends that she assumed I'd want to attend, if I could make it work. I called her that same day calmly and said I noticed the pattern repeating itself, and she apologized immediately and moved Easter without a single word of argument. That, more than any single dramatic conversation, is what convinced me something had actually shifted. It wasn't the big reveal that changed my mother. It was watching her catch herself, months later, in a small moment nobody else would have noticed, and choose differently. There is a piece of this story I haven't told you yet, which is what actually happened with the business itself over that first year, because I think the numbers matter, and I think anyone who has ever had to rebuild trust through actual structure, rather than just feeling, will understand why I did what I did next. In December, within 2 weeks of that dinner, I sat down with my attorney and drafted a formal operating agreement for a leaner's table, something that had never technically existed in writing beyond the original trust documents my grandmother had signed. I brought in an outside bookkeeper, someone with no personal history with our family, to handle the day-to-day ledgers going forward, rather than the informal system my father had been running out of a shared spreadsheet and a shoebox of receipts for years. I set up quarterly meetings, actual scheduled meetings with an agenda, where my father, Emily, and I sat down together and reviewed real numbers: revenue by location, food cost percentage, labor cost percentage, outstanding loans and their repayment schedules. The first of these meetings, in January, was almost unbearably tense. My father kept apologizing for not understanding line items that, frankly, he'd never been taught to read, and I had to remind him, more than once, that the meeting wasn't a test. It was simply the transparency that should have existed from the beginning. By March, something had shifted in those meetings. My father started arriving with his own questions written down in advance, rather than waiting to be told what mattered. Emily, still new to her role at the flagship location, started presenting her own numbers instead of having someone summarize them for her. A folder of printed reports she'd learned to build herself using a template I'd shown her once and never had to explain twice. I remember sitting in the third quarterly meeting, in April, watching my father ask a genuinely sharp question about why the second location's beverage costs had crept up 2 percentage points over the previous quarter, and realizing that this, more than any apology, was what actual repair looked like in my family. Not sentiment. Structure. People finally doing the unglamorous work of understanding something instead of assuming it would simply take care of itself because it always had before. I also made a decision, around that same time, that I want to be honest about, because I don't think it fits neatly into either a story of pure forgiveness or pure boundary setting. I forgave the outstanding loan on my parents' home, in full, that spring, releasing the lien entirely and gifting them the remaining balance rather than continuing to hold it over the property. I did this not because I felt pressured to, and not because the earlier conversation had somehow entitled them to it. I did it because, watching my father show up genuinely humbled to those quarterly meetings, watching my mother catch her own habits mid-sentence and correct them without being asked twice, I believed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that this was a family actually trying rather than a family performing an apology to get back to comfortable. I told them about the forgiven lien at the following quarterly meeting, plainly, without ceremony, and my father cried, quietly, at the table, in a way I had genuinely never seen him do before, not even at my grandmother's funeral. I did not, however, forgive or restructure my ownership stake in the restaurants themselves. I want to be clear about that distinction, because I think it matters. Releasing the lien was an act of trust in who my parents were becoming. Keeping majority control of the business was simply sound judgment, the kind my grandmother had exercised herself, and the kind I intend to keep exercising for as long as I'm the one ultimately responsible for 31 employees' paychecks. Trust rebuilt through actual behavior over time is not the same thing as handing back the exact same unaccountable structure that caused the damage in the first place. I had to sit with that distinction myself for a while before I felt settled in it, and I think it's one of the more important things I've learned through all of this. Forgiveness and restored access to your resources are not the same gift, and you're allowed to give one without automatically giving the other. Emily and I are surprisingly in a better place than we've ever been. She apologized to me directly, months later, not with a card or a text, but sitting across from me at a coffee shop. For the engagement party, for the years before it, for a lifetime of not really seeing what it might have felt like to be the sibling standing slightly outside the spotlight she'd occupied without ever really asking for it. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it, and I also told her that an apology doesn't erase 30 years. It just gives us somewhere honest to start building from. We are slowly building. If you've stayed with me this whole time, I want to leave you with the thing I've come to understand most clearly out of all of this. Being the quiet one in a family, the reasonable one, the one who keeps showing up and keeps absorbing and keeps saying it's fine, is not the same thing as being generous. Real generosity requires honesty, and I spent most of my life mistaking silence for kindness, when really it was just a slower, more exhausting form of disappearing. Holding your own worth, your own resources, your own boundaries, isn't cruelty toward the people who have overlooked you. It's simply what happens when you finally decide to stop making yourself smaller so that everyone else's story can stay comfortable. I think, too, about how easy it would have been for that dinner to become something else entirely, something bitter, a moment I used to humiliate the people who had humiliated me for years without ever quite calling it that. I understand the impulse. There were nights, in the weeks after my wedding, when I lay awake composing furious speeches I never gave, imagining the sharpest possible version of that reveal, one designed purely to wound. But when the actual moment arrived, unplanned, almost accidental, I found I didn't want that version. I wanted the truth, laid out plainly, without embellishment, because the truth alone turned out to be more than enough. You don't need cruelty to be taken seriously. You need clarity, and you need to finally stop being afraid of how your own reality lands on people who have spent years assuming it would never surface. There's a specific image that stays with me from that quarterly meeting in April, the one where my father cried at the table after I told him the Leon was gone. After he'd collected himself, he looked at me and asked, quietly, why I'd done it, why I'd give up that kind of security after everything. I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't given up security at all. My security had never actually come from holding that Leon over his head. It had come from finally being someone who told the truth in my own family, who no longer needed to manage anyone's comfort at the expense of my own reality. Releasing the Leon didn't cost me anything I actually needed. Years of silence had cost me plenty, and I wasn't interested in trading one kind of quiet suffering for another kind of quiet control. I wanted something different for all of us, something built on actually seeing each other, and that, it turns out, was worth far more than $68,000 ever could be. I also want to say something to anyone watching who is sitting on their own version of this leverage right now, whatever form it takes, financial or otherwise, and wondering whether revealing it will make them the villain of their own family's story. It won't, not if you handle it the way I event. You'll learn to, without theater, without cruelty, simply with facts and the willingness to let people sit with the discomfort of finally seeing you clearly. The people who truly love you will find their way through that discomfort to something more honest on the other side. The people who don't will show you exactly who they've been all along, and that, too, is information worth having, however painful it is to receive. I didn't reveal what I held to punish my family. I revealed it because I was done shrinking to protect people who had never once thought to shrink for me. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I hope you'll take that same permission for yourself, whatever form it needs to take in your own life. Maybe it isn't a trust fund or a restaurant chain. Maybe it's simply the truth about how tired you are, or how long you've been quietly holding something together while everyone else assumed it would hold itself. Whatever it is, you don't owe anyone your silence just because you've gotten good at keeping it. I sometimes think about that 9-year-old girl standing in the kitchen doorway watching her mother ice a Princess Castle cake for someone else's birthday, and I wish I could tell her that none of it was actually about the cake, and that one day, she'd learn to stop waiting for someone else to notice her worth, and simply claim it herself, quietly, factually, without apology. I think she'd be relieved to hear it. I think a lot of us would be. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, drop a comment letting me know what part hit hardest, and share this with anyone who needs to hear it today.